We felt that this was an important topic to help strengthen our commitment to equity and justice. And I would like to welcome you on behalf of the YMCA of Greater Seattle and our ERG, our Employee Resource Group. And I am the co-chair. I'm René de los Santos. So thank you so much for joining us. Estoy muy emocionado. I'm very excited for today's conversation. All of the chat will go to YMCA of Greater Seattle staff. So if you want to enter that into the chat box, and you're going to keep everyone muted so that we can hear from our wonderful panelists today. I would also like to thank Samantha Morales, who's also a co-chair lead for our employee network group, and all of the panelists that will be joining us today from Seattle. Thank you so much. I would like to start off our conversation today with a land acknowledgement. As we gather, we acknowledge where we gather. Each of us are on unceded lands of the first peoples of this continent. In Seattle, we join you from the traditional territories of the Duwamish and coastal Salish people. We acknowledge their longtime stewardship of these waters and lands, creatures and plants. The relationship to this place is 10,000 years old, and we are only newcomers and guests. We honor the ongoing vitality of their community and traditions. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to hand this over to Kelly Moore.
Thank you, René. Welcome everybody to our Latinx and Hispanic Y community conversation. And we're talking about navigating labels today. And I just wanted to acknowledge that you're all here for a reason, that this is an important topic for you. And I'm so happy that you're here because your perspectives matter too. We started talking about this in our group, and I'm really glad it's expanded to our community and that we get to talk and hear the insight of our panelists because they're all community leaders who are engaged in that work. So, and I also just want to say, I know that some of us represent Hispanic Latinx communities, and some of us are working in the community empowering, some of us are here as allies, and the reasons we're here are as diverse as our communities. I know that for me, I'm here because I grew up in Latin America, moved to the US at 18, and then realized I had a lot to learn about what it's like here in the US and across history and systems. And so as we're talking about systemic racism, how to interrupt this, how labels might affect that, I just want to acknowledge it's a personal place for everyone, and I really appreciate you all being able to engage in that. So thank you. All right, so before we jump into that conversation, I want to introduce each of our guest panelists. First, we have Linda Gonzalez Chavez, and she's the Senior Vice President, Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Global Officer for the YMCA. And then we have Sandra Huber, and she's a Community Engagement Manager at Verdant Health Commission. Cynthia Durieta is the Director of Programs at Open Arms Perinatal Services. Jose Diaz is a Manager, Equity and Systems Advancement of the Y of the USA. So I wanted us to get to know our panelists a little bit better and give them space to introduce themselves, the role that they serve in, their pronouns, and to share about the important work that they're doing. So let's go ahead and start with you, Linda.
Well, gracias, Kelly. Buenas tardes, mi gente. It's such a pleasure to be here. Love working with you all, and I love this conversation. So I'll just introduce myself first on a personal note on how I identify. As I often say, to understand Latinos and Latinas, the Latinx community, you really have to understand the colonial construct of which our journey led us to. In these cases, for my particular family, being from New Mexico for many, many generations, as my family always said, we didn't cross the border crossed us numerous times. I identify as an Indigenous Latina, specifically as a Chicana. That word to me means something very important because it does demonstrate that we are Indigenous people that have been in this on this continent since we crossed the Bering Strait coming from East Asia and moving. And then seeing how the Spanish came in, the French, and then the US. And so it's something that really identifies for my family. It's also a very interesting question for me as in my role as the Global DEI officer, because I have to, so much of our work is related to data and collections and understanding where the gaps are. And so I'm excited about this conversation as we start narrowing in. And so many of my colleagues that often say, we really want to have this conversation because many of us don't know how people identify. And as my colleagues have stated, our ethnic heritage as the Hispanic Latino community in the United States is just one of our dimensions of diversity. As so many of us talked about, looking at our diversity wheel and intersectionality, how important it is for us to really begin to engage in that individual lens of what so many of our colleagues are sharing with us today, our own personal lived experience, and then how we are able to bring it up so that we're able to also move the organization, in this case, the YMCA, to be more representative of the communities that we serve. Just lastly, as we start looking at the journey that we've taken from census and the labels that were introduced by the census and how we've been able to start moving that in collaboration, but still how important it's been for our community to ensure that they're recognized in this country, both from a resource space, but then also from an inclusion space. And one that I'm really, I can't wait for the day when we can all really recognize collectively what our Hispanic Latino community has done to support the growth of this country and many countries across the globe. Such an honor to be with you. Excited about the conversation.
Thank you so much, Linda. And then Sandra, would you be willing to share a little bit about yourself as well?
Buenas tardes for some of you, and I'm so excited to be here, and wear a lot of many hats, like many of us doing community work. And not only do I have the job that pays the bills at Burden Health Commission in Linwood as a community engagement manager, but I also bring the voice, not unique, not that a disclaimer, I can't speak for our entire community because we're not a monolith, but I have the honor to work in partnership with community members. And I always tell everyone that I cheat. I don't have any particular genius. I just ask our people what they want and they'll tell you, and then you follow that. And typically it's a really good outcome. So I'm excited about this conversation because many times I have found myself with the struggle of having come as an immigrant, having come to this country from a place where people were not having their identity hyphenated. I was just who I was, and there has been a transition. I got to go to college in Wichita, Kansas, and I left Panama, my country of origin, as Sandra Solano, and then I got to Wichita, and all of a sudden I was Sandra Solano Hispanic, and then I moved to California, and I was Sandra Solano Latina, and then I moved here to Washington, and it was a completely different experience here, and finding myself that there was a part of me that was missing on my identity, which was the Afro-descendant and who my people were before they got here. So I'm excited to share with you today a little summary of my journey on getting there and what I had to learn. And I hope you find it valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Cynthia, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everybody. Hola, me llamo Cynthia Turrieta. My name is Cynthia Turrieta. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I'm the director of programs at Open Arms Perinatal Services. And Open Arms has been around for about 25 years. It started with a group of volunteers providing free of cost perinatal services. And we expanded to lactation services, specifically providing services for communities of color, BIPOC communities. I myself am a first generation Latina. That's how I identify. My parents immigrated from Mexico, so from Guadalajara, Michoacan, for anybody that's out there. And so navigating, very like traditional Mexican household in, in America can have its own struggles, and then learning more about my identity, I think, and really excited to have a conversation here about that, my experience. And I think it's important to acknowledge that experiences are very different within our communities. My experience being raised here in America as first gen is very different from someone who came here and immigrated, and was raised in their country of origin. So I'm excited to have this conversation. I have dedicated my work to community-based services. As a therapist, I served the Latinx community, and I think, like Sandra was saying, really understanding that there's differences and honoring the variances in our culture and how people identify is really important. And I am really, I think one of the things that has brought me to this work is to try address the barriers in services for families and to make them more accessible, because there's systems that are not meant to support our families well. And I'm using all of my work and experience and time to try to support bridging those gaps, and especially in the maternal and infant health space and reproductive justice. So thank you for sharing time, and I'm glad to share this space.
Thank you, Cynthia. All right, last but not least, we have Jose Diaz, who's going to share about all the important work he's doing.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jose Diaz. I am Manager of Equity and Systems Advancement at YMCA of the USA. In a nutshell, my work supports local Ys as they begin thinking about working through strategies to help advance their own anti-racism work, which I think, my own journey, my personal journey has kind of led me to this space. I grew up in New York City. I come from a very proud Puerto Rican background. I'm probably what you would consider to be a New Yorican. For those of you who don't know what the term New Yorican means, it suggests a New Yorker of Puerto Rican descent, which is important because going back to Linda's earlier point about the colonial construct under which Latinidad falls, right? The great Puerto Rican migration from the island of Puerto Rico to the US occurred in the early 1900s, which was spurred in large part by, shifting industries from agriculture to manufacturing to folks being granted US citizenship. It was the relationship that the island has with the US that compelled many Puerto Ricans to move. And when they came to the US, their first stop was New York City in the Lower East Side. I am the result of that migration. And the New Yorican movement itself was birthed in the 60s and 70s to support New Yorkers of Puerto Rican descent who were not Puerto Rican enough for the island, but were still too Puerto Rican to be accepted fully by the US. And so they embraced their uniqueness as New Yorkers whose families were from Puerto Rico and embraced that and celebrated that. And I am a product of that, a very proud product. When you hear me talk, often I talk, that is the lens through which I view the world. I view the world through my New Yoricanness. I view the world through my own Boricuaness. So Boricua is an indigenous term to describe the indigenous people, the Taino, who lived in Puerto Rico before Christopher Columbus arrived. In fact, the original name of the island is Boriquén, and her people were Boricua, the Taino. And so when you hear Puerto Ricans saying, especially Puerto Ricans in New York City, when you hear us describe ourselves as Boricua, it is really a lifting up of our ancestral roots and paying homage to that. And also recognizing that the island is, because of that colonial construct, has a very complicated, to this day, as we see what's happening in Puerto Rico right now, has a very complicated, layered, nuanced relationship with the United States. And so for me, while I didn't grow up in Puerto Rico, I was that culture, the heritage lives in me. And so me claiming my New Yorkerness, me claiming being Boricua, those are things that firmly root me in my identity and give me strength every day and allow me to navigate in the work that I do in the communities that I work with.
Thank you. I didn't know a lot of that. That was really interesting. And I love that you all, you know, you shared so much about your personal journey and that you carry that into the work that you do. That makes what you do so much more impactful. So thank you. All right, so we're going to shift into some specific questions about opportunities that we have right now on issues in intersectional and equity lenses. And so let's start with you, Linda. You'd already mentioned the US Census a little bit. Would you mind going into how that could create categories where Hispanic and Latino are not necessarily considered a race, and how that might affect mainstream thinking on the diaspora?
Sure, absolutely. And I know my other colleagues will add to it. But as the census was constructed in the United States, and again, looking at it, you know, in a place like New Mexico that didn't become a state until 1912, right? Some of those particular things. The US Census was trying to get an understanding of who was in the United States, and started the census and started utilizing the race categories. And so that already started us getting very, very tricky, because there wasn't a place for what we now call Hispanic Latinos. So they referred to as Spanish-speaking Americans. So that was the first space of which it started. And then it started evolving as more people were saying, well, we've been here for this long and we don't speak Spanish. Or for newcomers into the country, it was the same thing, it wasn't capturing it. And so one of the first terms that was used was Hispanic. And so, and the one that we're utilizing now, there's still an ongoing conversation with census, because the calculations have been misleading, because as my colleagues were saying, there's a space there for race, of which Latinos and Latinas can identify of any race. The background is very, very mixed. And so we're categorized as an ethnic group. There are some other things also as we navigated US politics and the categories of which people from Latin America, broadly, how they were characterized, and starting with places like Mexico. And so very much like what Jose was talking about related to the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, very, very much my part of the world, this whole Southwest, that area that was, you know, broadly part of Mexico, but had been, again, indigenous people taken on by the Spanish, then by the Mexicans, then by the United States. It's become very, very complex as we navigate that. And so these tallies of how we continue to work with the US government is also part of that construct. One of the things that I would say when we look at the race issue is that for many communities that originated, like Spain, Italy, as we start looking at the Greeks, there was a process in the United States of which they became white and started getting captured within white census categories. I would say because of the land that was shared with Mexico in particular, in Spain, from the Spanish-American War to the Mexican-American War, that was part of that, of how we started looking at Latinos as a separate race category. And it just becomes really complex. I know that my colleagues I know can't wait to jump into this conversation, so I'm going to limit myself and pass it back to you, Kelly, because I want to hear them too.
Thank you, Linda. No, that history really helps too, because it is such a complex issue. Sandra, do you want to jump in and talk about how, like, the whole diaspora of Latin America and Hispanic community and how those categories might affect thinking in our society?
Thank you, Kelly and Linda. Thank you for saving me quite a bit of that information to share about. I will still share a little bit of the history, but I think as I share my introduction, it's been a journey. And even though you might think of Hispanic and Latino as terms that many of us start thinking, well, you know, that's my race, that's my identity, the same way that white and Black and Asian people identify themselves. But the truth is that our community of Latinos, Hispanics, whatever the term that we're labeled on, is very diverse. And the term Hispanic and Latino really refer to ethnicity, culture, and identity. They are they're groups based on shared culture. And that was one of the things that I learned when I got to this country, because where I come from, people are not divided by, because it's a uniform culture. So it's not about skin color or race or other physical attributes. However, it's really complex when we see that you can look Japanese or whatever we think Japanese looks like, or Chinese, and be Latino. Next slide, please. In basic terms, what we're talking about is physical traits is really what we're talking about when we are talking about race and ethnicity. Are you guys seeing the PowerPoint presentation? No? Well, I can still talk without that. So anyway, when I looked up on, I had some community members asking me about how do I define race? Well, I went up and what do? You look up on the dictionary, and Merriam-Webster defines race as a category of humankind that shares certain distinctive physical traits. So I started to understand that race here in the United States is usually associated with biology and linked with physical characteristics, even though we know that race really is a construct. So it covers a relatively narrow range of options. So somebody might be considered to be of a certain race, like me, Black, and but I'm also my culture, my identity as a human being. I identify as a Latina. So when you are looking at ethnicity, it's a broader term than race, and that's the richness of our culture, right? That the terms differentiates among groups of people according to the cultural expression and identification. Next slide, please. So to add a little bit of what Linda shared about the history, in 1976, the US Congress passed what was the only law in this country's history that mandated the collection and analysis of data for a specific ethnic group. So we were, as Linda shared, Americans of Spanish origin or descent. And the language of that legislation described this group as Americans who identify themselves as being of Spanish-speaking background and trace their origins or descent from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Central and South America, and other Spanish-speaking countries. And I don't know if everybody's aware, but this includes 20 Spanish-speaking nations from Latin America and Spain itself, but not Portugal, Portuguese-speaking Brazil. Next slide, please. Well, when we're all getting to understand that the terms Hispanic and Latino have existed for a very long time, it wasn't really until they were introduced into the United States Census that they became popularized, and we even started thinking about what that meant. Next slide, please. And I love to talk about, given that I'm originally from Panama, and sometimes people think that Panama is part of the United States. We're not. Latin America is comprised of 33 different countries located within South America, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. And one thing that when I came to this country was really confusing to me is that we refer to the United States as America. And all my geography education told me, it's like, how could we be America when America is a continent different? I was taught that the North American continent, the Central American piece of it, and the South American piece of it. So it was really confusing to try to figure that out until I understood that this country sometimes likes to abbreviate the way we share knowledge, and had gone, instead of United States of America, we just went with America. Next slide, please. As I shared, there are 33 countries that comprise the term Latin America. Next slide, please. So one of the ways in which we're learning or not learning about what it means to be Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, and all that is the media and the popular culture, right? And in 2020, there were 62 million of us, around 18% of US residents. And since 2010, this group, who we are, those of us who identify within this community, have grown more than 23%. I think that's pretty significant, because you're starting to see, for whatever reason, finally the acknowledgement that things like Spanish language media, such as commercial television shows, magazines, websites, even news, Univision, Telemundo, and social media accounts reflect that understanding, that awareness, not in everything and not always in a positive way, but it's starting to finally really being given some focus. Next slide, please. And it all comes down to identity, right? I was very upset, and I will mention the particular website that I was looking at when I wanted to find Latino women that were working in a computer for a computer class I was doing. I was really disappointed and actually hurt that the pictures that they had were of women that look Hispanic on a maid's outfit cleaning a computer. And this wasn't that long ago. So what does that mean? With the Hispanic or Latino community, there are also differences in how people self-identify. For example, people like me that are Black might identify as Afro-Latina or Afro-Caribbean, and this helps to distinguish ourselves from those who share their race, but have a different cultural background. And it's taking some time for people to acknowledge that we can be both. And I'm also the proud mom of a biracial child who is part Panamanian, part German, and part American. And I am proud to say that she doesn't feel that she has to choose between those identities, that her heart, who she is wide enough that she can be all of that. Next slide, please.
Sandra, I might
Yeah.
pause this there to come back to the presentation, just so we can run by Cynthia as well, if that's okay, and then come back.
Sure.
Okay.
I don't have much left to say. So yes, we can. The only other thing that I wanted to say, that Latin America is home to the largest Black population outside of Africa, and that when we use each one of these terms, it's best to respect whatever label a person gives themselves, remember intent versus impact, and realize that they may or may not have a preference. So with that, I pass it on to Cynthia. Thank you.
I don't think I have much to add. I'm learning a lot as well. And I think that that's really important. Thank you, Sandra, for doing that. As I'm like thinking about this, I think what's really coming to mind is how we approach really trying to provide like really focused support, or really understanding that not all of us, like I've sat in groups and I'm like, I can't be the only Latin representation. There's so many, and then there'll be so many things that are going to be missed, right? So that's really what's coming up for me right now, is really trying to center the voices and really understand who we're trying to, what in providing services or providing support, addressing gaps and barriers, and understanding that there are different needs. And I think that's one of the harmful pieces of thinking about Latin community as a monolith, is that we're really missing the variances and the richness and the deep culture and the differences that people can bring. And so I think that's the piece that I'm really sitting with right now, is really trying to, how do we do that as a community and support each other, elevate our differences and our commonalities as a community.
Thank you. I feel so lucky. We're learning history and anthropology and all kinds of things here. So thank you all. Jose, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, that question, as I read it in preparation for this call, it made me think of two things. One, the large number of countries that comprise Latin America. I think oftentimes, and that does include Haiti, I think we oftentimes neglect Haiti, and that's for a number of reasons. One being anti-Blackness, even within Latin American countries, right? But I think we need to also acknowledge that, places like Haiti and Brazil fall under Latin America. Now, if you were to ask someone of Haitian descent or background if they identify as Latino, they may or may not, because of their proximity or lack of to Latin America, because of anti-Blackness, right? So we also need to name that. I also, as I was reading the question in preparation, the question about the census, I think the one thing that kept coming up to me was, again, just how confusing those labels can be, especially if you're not from the US. And even myself, born and raised in New York City, I remember some years ago applying for I think it was my FBI fingerprints, because I work for the Y, and we are a child service agency, and I was doing my FBI fingerprints, and they were asking for my race, and the categories I remember very clearly on the FBI's Identigo website. It was Black African American, Asian Pacific Islander, and then it said Caucasian/Latino, and I was like, wait a minute. So if I was new to this country, or if I navigated the world strictly under this umbrella of Latinidad. Now, I've said that I've identified as Puerto Rican. That is right, that's how I navigate the world. If I saw that category and I didn't understand, I would check that off. And so what does that mean for the data we're collecting, which, skews white, right? This country skews towards whiteness. And then I think about the historical context of whiteness in Latin America. There was a real program in Latin America called Blanqueamiento, which was suggested to whiten the population. In Puerto Rico, when the island was too brown because of the indigenous Taino and then the enslaved Africans who were brought over, Spain said, oh no, this island is too brown. We're going to open it up to European settler colonists. And what happened, it was a concerted attempt to make the population white. I also think about in Latin America, many of us heard this term, even I in New York City as a kid heard it, called mejorar la raza, which means to better the race or advance the race. And that suggests making your progeny, your children, lighter and whiter by procreating with someone, with a white person, right? In an attempt to whiten the race. Because white meant better. So I think of that when I think of that question about the census and how these things erase in service to whiteness in this country, rather than celebrate and acknowledge the diversity under which Latin America falls. I mean, you have, I think, Sandra, you mentioned it earlier with Asian folks. People don't realize, there are Asian Latinos because of the ways in which Asians migrated to this side of the world, right? You had Asians that came to Cuba and then fled Cuba in the 50s and then went to Puerto Rico, right? And so there's a significant Chinese Puerto Rican population that resettled in Puerto Rico. So, those census forms don't do us any service. And then lastly, I know we, move on, but the last thing I think about is because of the complication of the census and how it's designed, it creates categories of confusion. In 2010, when you look at the 2010 census category, the 2010 census for Puerto Rico, 70% of Puerto Ricans on the island self-identified on the census as white. Now, if you've ever been to Puerto Rico, you know that's not the case, right? It is a majority brown island. That doesn't mean that there aren't white Puerto Ricans of primarily European descent, but there are also black Puerto Ricans. There are still, mestizo. And so there are brown Puerto Ricans on the island. And then interestingly enough, fast forward 10 years later to the 2020 census, and there was real intentional conversation on the island about what it meant to be brown, what it meant to be black. And so the 2020 census revealed that 17% of Puerto Ricans on the island identified as white only. And so there was some real understanding of one's own brownness, one's own blackness, and saying these are okay and these should be lifted up and represented and counted on the census. And that's all.
Jose, I would just add, this is really interesting, but I would add that many of the terms or labels also came out of colonization, specifically from the Spanish and the Portuguese.
Right.
So, again, as we started looking at the construct, which is Latinidad, is that, as Sandra was saying, at the same time that we brought in around 500,000 enslaved Africans, Brazil alone, 4 million.
Yeah.
As we start looking at those numbers, are significant. And so Spain and Portugal themselves started different terminology. So there were the Spanish, those that were born in Spain, and then those that were born Spanish in the United States that were married to another Spaniard were criollos. They were the ones that created the term mestizo, mestiza, mulato, mulata, which shows mestizos more indigenous, mulattos more of the Afro background. And as Jose was also stating, for many of us that are doing our DNA now, the East Asian DNA is identical to Native American DNA. So like in my particular, space, there's this, a lot of Spanish, 30% Native, but then there's, 10% African, and so it's this real ethnicity that was also driven largely by the enslavement of indigenous and African peoples. And again, even as we start looking at where the differences can arise when we look at the island of Hispaniola, for example, that's shared by the Dominican Republic and Haiti, even the separation within that itself from this historical making yourself whiter or more like the colonizer. There was a horrible term that was utilized by the Spanish for an indigenous person that who had children with an enslaved African. They actually used the word salta atrás, which means jump backwards. I mean, that is the essence of how historical this conversation can go.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Linda. Y'all are touching on colorism and systemic oppression. And Sandra, I think you wanted to add something too, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly, you just read my mind, that even among our own communities, there was in South America, just like there was in other parts of Latin America, that invitation before World War II to fill those ships coming from Europe to whiten many parts of the country. And what ended up, the different countries, and what ended up happening is that the racism, the discrimination, the white is better also came with that. And even among ourselves, I still hear some members of some countries that have a heavy European influence, that they have been, that the idea has been passed on to them that they're better than our indigenous and our mixed people. And at best, they hide behind mestizo as a way of saying, I'm not so bad. And I was one of those that grew up with a father who was Black, but he always said, mejorar la raza. And he had it ingrained in him that my goal was to marry a white person and have white babies. And he wasn't totally wrong, in the sense that even though I understand now how damaging that is, he wasn't wrong. I do have a child who is light skinned, who passes for white, who at 10 knew that, and her life has been easier than I had it. So it's not that he was particularly wrong, but the way that deprecation, that rejecting of one's own identity is part of what I work in mental health, because that has an impact, that has a corrosive impact in our souls and the core of who we are.
That's a really good point. It gets just absorbed and ingrained there. Thank you for sharing that. And everything that you're saying really ties in beautifully to the next question, which is where these labels come from. And I'm just asking if the multilingual, multicultural community been the driver of their cultural labels, and it's already sounding like, you know, historically it hasn't, but when you look at the larger diaspora, what do you think is like who's driving those labels, or how do people self-identify, I guess, is where we could go from there.
I could start by saying that I do still believe is what we're talking about here, this whiteism that dominates that. I mean, I think that there is a lot to navigate there, and just looking at the institutional isms, the systemic isms that exist in this labeling, and how it's played out in this colonial history and where we're at right now. I think that there's a lot that drives it. I do think that as this conversation improves and more people are represented in government, that are moving these kind of conversations into something that is more inclusive, especially in this space, I think that there's some opportunities there. And I also think it's like for community organizations just to continue to build on cultural competencies and engaging all communities so that they're able to self-identify. As Jose and others were stating, many people still want to identify based on their own national origin, whether they be Guatemalteco, American, Salvadoreño, or Mexicana, that also, there's places for that to happen. And we're really trying to capture our data in a more inclusive way. I do want to mention an organization that is now Unidos US. They used to be the National Council of La Raza. That organization became one of the big umbrella organizations that specifically were created out of the Southwest Council of La Raza to start changing government. And they started as a real activist group. And I think that more organizations like that can advocate in a more broader platform could be really helpful for changing the US government-based systems of capturing data. Oh, sorry, Jose, I think you were going to say something.
No, I was just reflecting on that. When I read that question and I heard, as I was hearing you speak as well, Linda, I was just reflecting on my own experiences and thinking about the ways in which we talk to each other as Latinos. And again, Latino is not when I was growing up, Latino was a term that I embraced because I felt like I was part of this larger community. As I've gotten older, there's still some challenges there, right? And so, you know, I remember I remember several years ago having a conversation, a white man from Argentina, and he was talking Spanish and I was talking Spanish back to him. And he said to me, "Are you Puerto Rican?" And I said, "Yes." And I was all proud. I was like, "How could you tell?" He goes, "Because your Spanish is terrible." And he said, and I was like, "Excuse me." And he said, you know, South Americans like Argentinians and Venezuelans, we speak the best Spanish. And I was getting pissed. And I had to check him and say, first of all, I don't think you understand that Caribbean Spanish, right? Cuban Spanish, Dominican Spanish, Puerto Rican Spanish is heavily influenced by African dialects and indigenous Taino dialect. So when you're saying that our Spanish is trash or terrible, that's a classism that you're putting, and it's also kind of racist. I need you to unpack that. And I said all that to him in my broken Spanish, right? But I use that anecdote to say that as I've gotten older, I wonder how much of that umbrellaness of Latinidad is more institutional than it is like interpersonal. Because even in my daily life, I don't recall too many instances where I'm talking to a Dominican and, you know, they say they're Latino, they say they're Dominican, right? Or, you know, someone says they're Cuban. And there's this nice interplay and intersection of our cultural backgrounds, because certainly Puerto Rican food is very similar to Dominican food, like almost the same, right? but we are very prideful of our own respective backgrounds. So as I read that question, just thinking about how much of it has been institutionalized, and because of this institutionalization to serve whatever purposes it serves, how we've internalized that, and in respective countries internalizing Latinidad, how we've used that to try to create solidarity when in fact it still does harm and it still does erase people, because we're not lifting up their uniqueness, their own cultural and ethnic backgrounds, by saying, oh no, we're all Latino. But I wonder again, just how much of that stems back from a larger institutional force that, we've all just kind of taken on because we're all the same in Latin America.
Yeah,
if that makes any sense. I probably rambled.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I want to dive deeper into the institutional part of it and how it drives it. Cynthia, did you want to talk about that at all before we go into that?
Not too much. I was sitting with the conversation about the closest to whiteness and dominant culture, and how a lot of the terms that were given are really perpetuating erasure of like the differences in the culture. So I was thinking about it, and then you called on me, and I was like, what am I had a thought in my head. But anyways, I think what was really coming up for me is, Sandra, I know you mentioned media, but I think also when we're thinking about like images that we're seeing, and I grew up with like novelas, and I grew up with like, and those instances, those representations were folks closer to whiteness. And I think that also does a lot of damage to our community, and also perpetuates colorism. So I think that is, I just really wanted to thank you for bringing that up. And as far as like the census and kind of bringing in this question, it would be really great, and this is not just to our community. In other communities, there really needs to be more teasing out to really understand who is being represented in the census. This is not just like relevant to us. It's relevant in a lot of other communities. But it really, because the census is a very powerful thing to use for where certain resources are provided and those kinds of things. But it really would take, a deep dive and decolonizing all of these different terms in order for us to be able to start to do this.
Thank you. We're diving deep here, y'all. Okay, we've got 10 minutes left to go, and I think we might want to leave a few minutes for some questions. So let's go to what community-led movements are currently happening that are reducing those barriers and helping communities reclaim and redefine themselves. And I know y'all are part of some of those movements, so I'm really curious to hear what you're already doing. But Linda, do you want to start us off with that?
I would say, again, some of the groups like Unidos US, I think that they have affiliate groups that are grounded within community, and then they strengthen the power of all those unique organizations and lift them up for an advocacy space. So there's a lot of advocacy that's happening at the local level, as well as then bubbling up to the national level. I have to say that one of the groups that folks wouldn't think of that have done a lot around this have been our youth development workers, also young people, people that are working with young people. And you'll see more and more, even as we start looking at the term Latinx, for example, and younger generations who do not identify as binary. That's going to get really tricky when you start looking at a language that is sex-based. I mean, it's one of the more challenging things for people who are learning Spanish, is to understand that and what's going to happen. And so that in and of itself is going to get tricky, because you can start seeing that there is official organizations that monitor the movement of language itself. And there's already some really interesting conversations. So I'd say communities change it all the time. I think the way that we're starting to look at colorism, that's going to add a big factor to it. Is people, because for Chicanos, that immediately identifies us as, you know, indigenous, not of whiteness. And even conversations that are happening in Europe now, you know, where, you know, some of the colonial constructs, you know, originated from. People in Europe aren't looking at Spain as white Europeans. And as that immigration continues from other places, including, you know, Africa, what is going to happen in those particular spaces? So I think it's a really interesting thing that we need to keep a lens on across the globe.
Yeah, thank you. Sandra, do you have any thoughts on that?
The thing that came up for me as Linda was talking is that I belong in a part of the board of an agency here in Seattle called Movimiento Afro Latino Seattle, MAS, M-A-S, and how it has been so challenging to invite people to the table because, like Jose was saying, the whole Blackness and la negritud, that owning that, people are like, hey, I'm passing for white, but I'm really clearly have African descent, so they don't want to be open. So we have a really small team because we don't feel right as we're lifting the voices and the contributions of the African diaspora into our work. People have to have that journey of recognizing that that is part of who they are. And you cannot force that. You cannot tell people, hey, I know you're Black. You know what? If you're not claiming it, I'm not going to call it out. It's as your journey. So I'm hoping that organizations like that continue to focus on the arts and music and the way that we show up in the world as Black Latinos, that would help us in the whole colorism and the larger community. So that's my thought.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really valuable. Cynthia, do you want to add something there too?
What I will add is that we need to also think about when we talk about language specific services and broadening that up for the community, because it's not just Spanish. There's other languages, indigenous languages that need to be lifted. And also we're thinking about providing and connecting people to I mean, from my lens, is connecting people to services to support them in their birth and their lactation. Like, we really want to make sure that we're honoring all and being able to provide access to whoever like shows up, pretty much, and not just one. And it is still very difficult. There's a lot of barriers to providing services in other with other languages.
Yeah.
Jose, you have any thoughts on reducing barriers?
I think, you know, understanding. So what I'm seeing now as an adult, and I'm really happy to see it, is that people of Latin American origin are embracing their afrodescendiente, right? So their Afro-descendantness, right? People forget or don't realize that there were more enslaved Africans brought to Latin America than to the 13 colonies, right? And so Blackness is in Latin America. And because of anti-Blackness, people don't think that you can be Black and Latino or Latine, or right? So, but I'm seeing those conversations happening, particularly among young people, to Linda's point earlier, where, you know, growing up, Latine, Latinx was not a thing, but now we're seeing it become a thing. And who knows what that means for, you know, the language itself, which is very gendered. Also, the other thing too is Spanish as a language does not indicate one's Latinness, right? Just because you don't speak Spanish, as was the case for many New Yorkers, many Dominicans in New York City, does not make you less than, right? Yes. And I think we need to have that conversation intra-community as well. And that's already taking place. The last thing, you know, to Cynthia's point, you have indigenous languages. You have the Garifuna, I'm going to pronounce the Garifuna people, right, in the Caribbean coasts, who don't speak Spanish, but they speak other languages, right? And lifting them up too. And I think in my particular case, my own intersection, right, as a Puerto Rican, what I'm seeing happen now, especially in the wake of Hurricane Maria in 2017, in the wake of the summer 2019 protests in San Juan, and most recently with this last hurricane, what we are seeing are Puerto Ricans on the ground, on the island and in the diaspora, mobilizing and having conversations about their own Puerto Ricanness as it relates to this colonial construct. And so not just saying, okay, yeah, we're Latinos, but specifically let's carve out our niche as Puerto Ricans. And what does that really mean to be Puerto Rican under a colonial empire, right? And how do we move? How do we navigate? How do we preserve our culture and our customs and our systems when, you know, for the past 500 years, Puerto Rico has not been its own country. It is still the oldest colony in the world. And those conversations are happening on the ground today. So I think it's the young folks after us who are, you know, having these conversations and forcing folks like, you know, myself and older people to have these conversations too. So.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. Sandra, did you want to add something?
I just wanted to add real quick that part of what I'm seeing to Jose's point is that our young people are recognizing much easier than we are that English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French are colonizing languages. So
Yep.
they're starting to push back and say, if I'm trying to decolonize my life, my experience, my surrounding, then I also have to be aware that language, even though we like to say, well, I've heard many times, you're in America, speak English. Well, my daughter says I refuse to go by that because that's a colonizing language. So also to Cynthia's point that we need to work on how we take the indigenous or the aboriginal, the first people's languages to lift them up and have access and support for those, because those are the original languages, not all these colonizing languages that many of us were forced to learn.
Thank you for sharing that. Wow, what I'm hearing is we need a workshop with you all again because we've already run out of time. Thank you so much. There's so many themes about, you know, just pride and heritage and respect and lifting up people. And so I really appreciate you all. And thank you everyone for coming here today. We hope it's been meaningful for you. Sadly, we have to wrap up, but we're going to put a link in the chat for feedback. And we'd also love if you wanted to share a word or a quote from the conversation, something that resonated with you. And we're also going to share all the resources, the PowerPoint that Sandra had. We didn't get to all those slides, but we'll have access to them. So that's awesome. And we'll have a recorded copy of this video as well. So we'll be sharing that, and we invite you to more Y community conversations. We have another one coming up for Y disability justice in October. So stay tuned. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Stay well, everybody.
Yeah.
Gracias a todos.
Hasta pronto, mi gente.
Hasta pronto.